Some disappearances are tragic, others are mysterious. But a few are so strange that even the most experienced investigators struggle to explain how they could have happened at all. Especially when they occur in places where vanishing should be nearly impossible. In the Middle East, a region often associated with conflict and political tension, it is easy to assume that disappearances always have clear explanations, but some cases defy that expectation entirely, unfolding in ways that feel less like crimes and more like carefully erased moments in time. One of those cases begins not in a war zone, not in a remote desert, but in a controlled environment, involving a man who should have been constantly visible, constantly tracked, and constantly surrounded by people, and yet he vanished. And if you find stories like this intriguing, cases where reality seems to break its own rules and leave behind more questions than answers, consider subscribing to the channel, because these are exactly the kinds of mysteries we explore in depth. In 1978, Imam Musa, al-Sadr, was one of the most influential figures in Lebanon and across the Arab world. A religious leader whose voice carried weight not only in spiritual matters, but in politics and diplomacy. He was known for navigating complex tensions between communities and for building relationships with powerful leaders across the region. When he accepted an official invitation to visit Libya, it was not seen as unusual. Meetings like this were part of his role. He traveled with two companions, both trusted and experienced, and arrived in Tripoli where he was expected to meet with high-ranking officials connected to Muammar Gaddafi's government. Everything about the trip was documented. Everything was expected. Everything was normal. Until it wasn't, according to the official version released shortly after. Al-Sadr and his companions completed their visit and left Libya on a flight to Rome on August 31st. On paper, the timeline seemed clean, simple, and closed. But almost immediately, small inconsistencies began to appear. Italian authorities reported no record of their arrival. Airline manifests could not confirm their presence. Immigration checkpoints had no trace of their entry. No hotel, no taxi, no witness in Rome could place them there. It was as if the final leg of their journey had never happened. As investigators looked deeper, the situation became even more unsettling. Personal belongings belonging to the group were discovered still inside their hotel rooms in Tripoli, untouched, as if they had intended to return. Witnesses quietly began to contradict the official narrative, suggesting that al-Sadr had been seen entering a meeting shortly before his supposed departure, a meeting that would later become the center of countless theories. The case quickly shifted from a travel mystery to something far more disturbing. Because this was no longer about a missing traveler. This was about a man who disappeared in a place where every movement should have been accounted for. In the years that followed, explanations multiplied, but clarity never came. Some believed he had been killed after a political disagreement. Others claimed he had been detained in secret. A few insisted he might have been moved between undisclosed locations, hidden deliberately. But none of these theories could be proven. No body was ever recovered. No official record confirmed his fate. No single version of events ever fully explained what happened between the last confirmed sighting in Libya and the supposed arrival in Italy. And that gap, that missing piece of time, became the most disturbing part of the story, because strange disappearances are not always defined by what we know. Sometimes they are defined by what should exist but doesn't, a record that was never written, a camera that never captured, a witness who never came forward. And in cases like this, the absence of evidence does not feel like a coincidence. It feels intentional, which raises a question that would quietly echo through many other cases across the region. What if the strangest disappearances are not accidents, but events where Every trace of reality itself is carefully removed. If the first case raises questions about power and control, the next one introduces something even more unsettling. The idea that someone can disappear not despite chaos, inside in a way that leaves almotrau. By 2013, the Syrian civil war had already transformed entire cities into fragmented zones of control, where different groups governed different streets, and where danger no longer came from a single source, but from everywhere at once. In this environment, survival depended on awareness, connections, and sometimes pure luck. Razan Zeitouneh understood this better than most. She had spent years documenting human rights abuses, first under government rule and later during the war, becoming one of the most recognized voices exposing kidnappings, torture, and forced disappearances across Syria. Her work was known internationally, and for that reason alone, she had every reason to leave the country. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed, moving between safe locations, continuing her documentation and working alongside a small group of trusted individuals who shared the same mission. Among them were her husband, her mother, activist Samira Al-Khalil, and lawyer Nazim Hamadi. They operated quietly, carefully, always aware that they were being watched. And yet, what happened next defies even the logic of a war zone. On the night of December 9, 2013, the group was inside their office in Douma, an oppositiobob. The area was not peaceful, but it was not under immediate attack either. There were no major clashes reported that night, no explosions nearby, nothing that would suggest an imminent threat. Sometime during those hours, armed men entered the building. There were no reports of gunfire echoing through the streets. No neighbors described hearing screams or a struggle. No visible damage suggested forced entry. By the time morning came, all four were gone. Their office had been emptied with precision. Computers, documents, and storage devices containing sensitive information had been taken, leaving behind a space that felt less like the scene of a violent abduction and more like a carefully executed operation. The silence surrounding the event became one of its most disturbing features, because in a war zone, noise is constant. Explosions, gunfire, movement, chaos. But this disappearance happened quietly, almost invisibly, almost professionally. Suspicion quickly fell on a powerful armed group controlling the area at the time, an organization with both the capability and the motive to silence dissenting voices within opposition territory. Accusations circulated among activists, reports were filed, and international organizations began demanding answers. But no one was ever officially charged. No group definitively claimed responsibility. No location was ever confirmed, and no trace of the four activists was ever found. As the years passed, fragments of possible explanations began to surface, each one incomplete. Some former detainees claimed they had heard rumors of secret detention sites where activists were held without records. Others believed the group had been executed shortly after being taken. Some insisted they might still be alive, moved between undisclosed locations, hidden within a network of prisons that officially did not exist. But none of these claims could be verified, and that uncertainty created a deeper kind of fear. Because this case was not limited by a lack of attention. It was known internationally, it was documented, it was investigated, and still it remained unresolved. What makes this disappearance especially strange is not just the lack of answers, but the way it happened. No noise, no witnesses, no confirmed timeline after the event. Just a controlled removal of 4 people from a place where danger was expected. But not like this. Because even in war, most violence leaves traces. This did not, and that leads to a disturbing possibility. That sometimes the most effective way to make someone disappear is not through chaos, but through precision. If the previous case showed how multiple people can vanish at once, this one forces a more uncomfortable reflection, because it is not just about disappearance, but about what it means to return from one and then be taken again. Among the 4 activists who disappeared in Douma, Samira Al-Khalil's story carries a weight that goes beyond the moment she vanished, because her life had already been shaped by something most people will never experience. Years before the Syrian war, Samira had been arrested for her political beliefs and spent nearly 4 years inside Syrian prisons, in a system known for breaking people not only physically, but psychologically. Those who survive such conditions often leave with scars that never fully heal, memories that are never fully spoken, and a constant awareness of how fragile freedom really is. Samira understood what it meant to be erased. She had lived through it. And yet, after her release, she chose not to disappear into silence. Instead of retreating from public life, she became involved in helping others, supporting families searching for missing loved ones, and working quietly behind the scenes to assist those affected by detention and war. She was not someone seeking attention, but someone trying to hold together pieces of a reality that was falling apart around her, which makes what happened next almost impossible to ignore. On the night she vanished in Douma, alongside Razan and the others, Samira was not unaware of the risks. She knew how people disappeared. She knew what it looked like when someone was taken. She knew the patterns, the signs, the consequences. And still, she could not prevent it. There is something deeply unsettling about that, because it suggests that knowledge does not always protect, that experience does not always provide escape, that even those who understand the system can still be consumed by it. After her disappearance, her story began to change in a way that is difficult to describe, but easy to feel. When someone is imprisoned, there are records, even if they are hidden. When someone is confirmed dead, there is an ending, even if it is tragic. But when someone disappears completely, they exist in a kind of suspended state, neither present nor gone, neither alive in the world nor fully absent from it. For Samira's family, this created a reality without resolution. There was no place to visit, no confirmation to accept, no certainty to hold on to. Only questions that could not be answered. Her husband would later describe this kind of disappearance as a form of ongoing psychological violence. Not just against the person who vanished, but against everyone connected to them. Because time does not heal uncertainty, it stretches it. Days become months. Months become years. And the last memory of the person remains frozen, unchanged, while everything else continues to move forward. Photos do not update. Voices are not heard again. Conversations remain unfinished. And slowly, the absence itself becomes the only thing that feels real. Over the years, rumors emerged, fragments of possible truths that never fully formed into anything concrete. Some believed she had been transferred between secret detention sites. Others believed she had been killed early after the abduction. None of these claims could be proven, and so her story remains open, unresolved, incomplete, which leads to a disturbing realization. Surviving a disappearance does not mean escaping it forever. Sometimes it only means understanding how it works before it happens again. And in rare, deeply unsettling cases like this, a person can experience the same kind of erasure twice. Once inside a system that admits they exist, and once inside a reality that refuses to acknowledge them at all. Most missing person cases follow a familiar pattern. Someone leaves a place, travels somewhere, and then disappears along the way, creating a gap that investigators try to reconstruct step by step. But some cases challenge that logic entirely. Because what if there is no journey to trace? What if the disappearance doesn't happen between locations, but within a place? that is supposed to be completely controlled. The case of the missing Saudi princesses introduces that exact possibility. A situation where the mystery is not about where someone went, but whether they were ever allowed to go anywhere at all. The story gained international attention around 2014, when reports began to surface about four daughters of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, Sahar, Jawahar, Maha, and Hala. According to their mother, Princess Alanoji Alfayez, at least two of the sisters had been living under severe restrictions for years, possibly more than a decade. The claim was not that they had been kidnapped, not that they had disappeared in public, but that they had been isolated inside royal compounds, with limited communication and controlled movement. At first, the story seemed difficult to verify. Royal families operate under strict privacy. Access is limited. Information is controlled. But that is exactly what made the case more unsettling. Because when visibility is restricted, the line between privacy and disappearance begins to blur. According to the allegations, the restrictions began after the princesses expressed views that were considered controversial within their environment. Over time, their ability to communicate with the outside world became increasingly limited, with reports suggesting they were denied consistent access to medical care and independent contact. Saudi officials denied these claims. They stated the women were safe, that they were living normal private lives, that there was no reason for concern. But independent verification was almost impossible. There were no recent public appearances that could be confirmed without doubt, no unrestricted interviews, no direct, unsupervised communication. Occasionally, messages would surface, reportedly from the princesses themselves, describing their conditions, but these communications were difficult to authenticate and often disappeared as quickly as they appeared. And that created a different kind of mystery, because in most disappearance cases, investigators look for movement, travel records, witness sightings, surveillance footage. But here, the question was not where they went. It was whether they were ever free to move at all. As Chimi Pascamrer, then almost non-existent. The story faded from headlines, not because it was resolved, but because it became harder to access, harder to verify, and harder to discuss without reliable new information, which raises one of the most uncomfortable questions in cases like this. At what point does isolation become disappearance? And who has the authority to define that line? What makes this case especially strange is that it exists in a space where traditional investigation methods lose their power. There are no crime scenes to examine, no public locations to trace, no clear timeline to reconstruct. Only controlled information and controlled silence. Because when access to truth is limited, even the concept of being missing becomes difficult to prove. And in that uncertainty, something deeply unsettling begins to take shape. The possibility that a person does not need to be taken from the world to disappear from it. Sometimes, all it takes is for their reality to be hidden behind walls that no one else is allowed to see through. Not every strange disappearance involves political figures, war zones, or controlled environments, and sometimes that is exactly what makes a case more disturbing, because it removes every obvious explanation and leaves behind something much harder to process. This is the kind of case that begins with routine, a normal day, a predictable schedule, a life that shows no signs of disruption, and then, without warning, a person simply stops existing within that pattern. In the early 2000s, a man living in a major Middle Eastern city, described by friends and family as disciplined, consistent, and deeply tied to his daily routine, left his home one morning exactly as he had done countless times before. There was nothing unusual about his behavior that day, no signs of distress, no indication that anything was about to change. He had plans. He had responsibilities. He had a life that was actively in motion. He told someone he would be back later. He never returned. At first, there was no immediate panic. People assumed he had been delayed, that something unexpected had come up, that he would eventually make contact. But as hours turned into a full day, and then into several days without any communication, concern began to grow. Calls went unanswered. Messages received no response. Friends started retracing his steps. And that is when the first unsettling detail emerged. There was a clear point where his presence simply ended. Witnesses confirmed seeing him moving through familiar locations earlier that day. Some recalled brief interactions. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested distress or urgency. Surveillance footage in certain areas confirmed parts of his route, showing him walking, behaving normally, blending into the environment exactly as expected. And then, suddenly, nothing. No footage beyond a certain point. No witnesses after a specific time. No confirmed sightings. It was as if he had stepped out of the timeline entirely. Investigators began to consider the usual possibilities: accident, voluntary, disappearance, abduction, but each theory ran into the same problem. There was no evidence supporting any of them. No financial activity after that day. No use of identification. No trace of travel. No communication from unknown numbers. No signs of struggle at any point along his last known path. Even more unsettling, there were no known threats against him. No personal conflicts that might explain a targeted disappearance. No behavioral changes that might suggest he intended to leave his life behind. Everything about his situation suggested stability, and yet stability ended in total absence. As Chimi passed the case grew colder, because most disappearances leave behind something, even if it is small, even if it is ambiguous, a misplaced item, a broken pattern, a single clue that does not fully explain the event, but at least suggests direction. This case offered none of that. Only a clean break between presence and absence, which forces a different kind of question. What does it mean when a disappearance has no visible cause, no visible process, and no visible result? When there is no moment to investigate, no event to analyze, no action to reconstruct. It creates a type of mystery that feels less like a crime and more like an interruption in reality itself. Because the most disturbing element is not what might have happened. It is the complete lack of anything that shows how it could have happened. And in cases like this, the mind naturally tries to fill the gap, searching for explanations that may not exist, trying to impose logic onto something that resists it entirely. Because when someone disappears without a trace in a complex environment, we question the system. But when someone disappears without a trace in a normal, controlled, everyday setting, we begin to question something much deeper. When a single person disappears, there is a story, a timeline, a face, a name that people remember. But what happens when thousands of people disappear? What happens when the number becomes so large that individual stories begin to blur together, replaced by statistics, estimates, and uncertainty? In several parts of the Middle East, particularly in countries affected by prolonged conflict, there are entire groups of people who vanished without clear records, without confirmed timelines, and in many cases, without even a complete acknowledgement that they were ever officially detained. One of the most disturbing examples comes from detention systems that operate in secrecy, where individuals are taken without formal charges, without public records, and without communication with the outside world. Families are often left with nothing, no confirmation, no location, no explanation. Stepsons. In Syria, for example, human rights organizations have documented tens of thousands of enforced disappearances over the years. Individuals taken from homes, checkpoints, or streets, often in broad daylight, sometimes in front of witnesses, and then never seen again. At first, families try to follow the system. They ask questions, they search for records, they contact officials, but the system offers no clear answers. Some are told their relatives are not in custody. Others receive no response at all. And in some cases, years later, a document may surface listing a name among the dead, without details, without dates, without explanation of how or when it happened. But even those rare confirmations are inconsistent. Many names never appear anywhere. Former detainees, who are eventually released, sometimes describe overcrowded facilities, secret prisons, and constant transfers between locations designed to prevent tracking. They recall seeing people taken away during the night, never to return, with no explanation given to those left behind. But even these testimonies, while powerful, cannot provide certainty. They offer fragments, not conclusions. And this is where the strangeness of these disappearances becomes overwhelming. Because unlike individual cases, where the mystery centers around one person, here the mystery expands outward, becoming something systemic, something embedded in structures that are not fully visible from the outside. It becomes less about what happened to one individual, and more about how so many people can vanish within the same system without leaving a complete record. For families, this creates a reality that is difficult to describe. They continue searching. They hold on to hope. But they are searching within something that does not behave like a normal investigation. There is no clear path, no defined process, no reliable endpoint. Just layers of uncertainty that do not resolve over time. And time, instead of a clarifying the cifre, memoires fade. Witnesses disappear, records become harder to access, or are lost entirely. And slowly, the absence becomes normalized, which may be the most disturbing part of all. Because when enough people disappear without answers, it changes how disappearance itself is understood. It is no longer seen as an anomaly. It becomes part of the background, part of the system, part of reality. And in that transformation, something deeply unsettling happens. The question shifts from what happened to this person to something much harder to confront. How many disappearances can exist before they stop being treated as mysteries and start being treated as something expected? Most disappearances leave behind silence. Phones stop responding. Messages go unanswered. Digital activity suddenly ends. And that silence becomes part of the mystery. But in some rare cases, the opposite happens. There is a final message, a la signal, something that suggests the person was still present, still aware, still connected, just moments before everything stopped. And somehow, that makes the disappearance even more disturbing. In the late 2010s, a young individual from the Middle East, known to friends as active, social, and constantly connected through messaging apps and social media, became the center of a case that would confuse both investigators and those closest to them. There was nothing particularly unusual about their life. They maintained regular contact with family. They shared updates online. They followed a routine that, while modern and fast-paced, was still consistent enough that any sudden change would be immediately noticed. And that change came in the form of a message. Shortly before their disappearance, they sent a final communication to someone close to them. The content of that message was not clearly alarming, but it carried a tone that felt different, subtle, difficult to define, but enough to stand out in hindsight. After that message, all communication stopped. At first, it seemed like a temporary absence. People assumed they were busy, that they would respond later. But hours passed, then a full day, then several. Calls went unanswered. Messages were delivered, but never read. Online activity froze exactly at the point of that last message. When friends and family began to investigate, they found something even more unsettling. There was no clear disruption, no evidence of struggle, no financial activity suggesting movement, no travel records, no indication that the person had planned to leave. Their belongings remained in place. Their routine had simply ended, and yet that final message remained, a fixed point in time, a moment that suggested awareness, presence, and normalcy. Just before everything disappeared, investigators examined the digital trail, trying to extract meaning from the message, analyzing tone, timing, and context. Was it a signal, a hidden warning, a coincidence that only seemed important because of what followed? There was no definitive answer. Some believed the person may have been interrupted shortly after sending it. Others thought it could have been sent under pressure. A few suggested it meant nothing at all, that the real explanation existed somewhere else entirely. But without further evidence, the message became something else, not a clue, but a fragment, a piece of a moment that could never be fully understood. And that is what makes cases like this uniquely disturbing, because silence can be explained by absence. But a final message suggests presence. It creates a narrow window of time where something must have happened, but leaves no indication of what that something was. No transition, no visible cause. Just a sudden shift from connection to complete disappearance. Over time, the message itself begins to take on a different meaning. Not because its content changes, but because everything around it disappears. It becomes the last trace of a person who was fully present in the world, seconds before they were not. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is this: in a world where nearly every action leaves a digital footprint, where movements are tracked, recorded, and stored, how does someone still manage to disappear immediately after leaving behind a clear, intentional signal? It suggests something deeply uncomfortable, that even in systems designed to capture everything, there are still moments that slip through completely. When you look at each of these cases individually, they seem different. Different countries, different people, different circumstances. Some involve political figures. Others involve activists. Some happen in war zones. Others happen in ordinary, controlled environments. At first glance, they don't seem connected. But when you step back and observe them together, something begins to emerge. Not a single explanation, but a pattern of something much harder to define. Because the strangeness in these disappearances is not just in how they happen, it is in how little they leave behind. Imam Musa, al-Sadr, disappears after entering a political environment where every movement should have been documented. Razan Zeitouneh and the Douma Four vanish in a war zone, but without the chaos that usually accompanies such events. Samira Al-Khalil disappears after already surviving the very system that took her once before. The Saudi princesses exist in a situation where disappearance may not even require leaving a physical space. An ordinary man walks through a normal day and then simply ceases to exist within it. Thousands of people vanish inside systems that do not fully acknowledge them. A final message is sent, and then nothing. Each case removes a different piece of what we expect reality to provide: evidence, noise, witnesses, continuity, closure. And when those pieces are removed one by one, something unsettling starts to take shape. Because we rely on patterns to understand the world, we expect events to follow logic. We expect actions to leave traces. We expect disappearances to have causes that can eventually be discovered. But these cases challenge all of that. They suggest that disappearance is not always an event. Sometimes it is a process. Sometimes it is something that happens quietly, gradually, or with such precision that it leaves behind nothing that can be followed. And maybe that is what makes these cases so disturbing. Not just that people disappear, but that in some situations, the systems around them are capable of absorbing that disappearance without breaking, without revealing, without correcting itself. Time passes. New events take attention. New stories replace old ones. And slowly, even the most unsettling cases begin to fade from public awareness, not because they were solved, but because they were never resolved in a way that forces closure. And that leads to one final, uncomfortable thought. If a disappearance leaves no evidence, no explanation, and no resolution, at what point does it stop being treated as a mystery and start becoming something the world simply learns to accept? Because the strangest disappearances are not always the ones that shock people in the moment. Sometimes they are the ones that quietly remain unanswered, until no one is left asking the questions anymore.